There was no such thing as a coincidence in the ancient world. When a child stopped speaking without warning, when a grown man collapsed in the field shaking uncontrollably, when a woman woke screaming from sleep every night for months, nobody looked for a medical explanation. Not because they were ignorant, but because the world they lived in was not divided between the natural and the supernatural. That division did not exist. Everything that happened, the drought, the fever, the madness, the death of a newborn, was connected to invisible forces that could not be seen, but could absolutely be felt. And in first-century Judea, among the villages and dusty roads and crowded synagogues where Jesus walked, the fear of evil spirits was not a superstition held by the uneducated few. It was a shared, daily, lived reality that shaped how people ate, slept, traveled, mourned, and prayed. To understand why the ministry of Jesus created the reaction it did, why crowds pressed against him, why parents carried their children from distant towns, why grown men fell to their knees in desperation, you have to first understand what life felt like when evil had no answer. What did it mean to watch someone you love deteriorate and have nothing to offer them? What did a family lose, not just emotionally, but socially and economically, when one of its members was believed to be afflicted by a spirit? And why did the presence of Jesus provoke such immediate, violent reaction from forces that had, until that moment, operated completely unchallenged? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. The village of first-century Galilee was not a peaceful pastoral scene. It was a dense, layered, exhausting world. Houses were built close together, sharing walls, sharing courtyards, sharing the smell of animals that were kept on the lower floor of the same structure where families slept above. The floor was packed earth or rough stone. Light came through small windows and open doorways. At night, the darkness was nearly total. A single oil lamp might burn in the corner, throwing unsteady shadows across the walls. The sounds outside did not stop. Dogs, wind, the occasional movement of livestock, voices from neighboring homes too close to ignore. This is the environment where fear lived. Not in the abstract, in the dark, in the sound you couldn't identify, in the child who woke screaming and couldn't say why. If this kind of content reaches you and you want to keep going deeper into the world of Jesus, consider subscribing to this channel. Every video is built to bring the ancient world back to life. In that context, the unseen world was not a theological idea reserved for priests and scribes. It was immediate. Villagers in Galilee, Judea, and the surrounding regions understood the world to be populated by spiritual forces. Some benevolent, most dangerous, all capable of interfering with human life. This was not unique to Jewish culture. It was the shared framework of the entire ancient Mediterranean world, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Rome to the villages of Syria. But within Jewish tradition, this framework had a particular shape, a particular vocabulary, and a particular weight. The Hebrew scriptures spoke of spirits in measured, careful terms. The books that circulated widely among common people, texts like 1st Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, documents from the Dead Sea community, were far more explicit. They described the origin of unclean spirits as the disembodied souls of the Nephilim, the offspring of fallen angels and human women, beings that roamed the earth seeking to afflict, possess, and destroy. Whether or not a first-century Galilean farmer had read those texts directly, the ideas they contained had filtered into the spoken culture, the prayers, the amulets, the whispered warnings passed from mother to daughter, from village elder to young father. You did not walk certain roads at night alone, not because of bandits, though they existed, but because of what else might be there. Crossroads were considered particularly dangerous, liminal spaces where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world grew thin. Graves were avoided, especially at night, because the dead were not entirely gone. Something remained, something that could attach itself to the living if you were careless. Ruins of abandoned places carried their own danger. Even certain hours of the day carried risk. The early afternoon heat, the hour when shadows disappeared, was considered a time of unusual spiritual vulnerability. This was not paranoia. This was the accumulated lived experience of generations trying to make sense of suffering in a world without the explanatory tools we take for granted. When a person developed what we would now recognize as epilepsy, falling suddenly, convulsing, foaming at the mouth, going rigid, the explanation was not neurological. The body was being controlled. Something had entered. When a person developed what we would recognize as severe schizophrenia, hearing voices, speaking to presences no one else could see, losing all capacity for ordinary life, the explanation was the same. A spirit had taken hold, and the consequences of that diagnosis were devastating. When someone in a household was believed to be afflicted by an unclean spirit, the suffering was not only theirs. The entire family carried the weight. In a society built on honor and collective identity, having an afflicted member was a source of shame, not because people were cruel, but because shame and honor were the actual currencies of social survival. Your family's reputation determined whether your daughter could be married, whether your son could find work, whether neighbors would trust your word in a dispute. A household with a spirit problem was a household in crisis on every level simultaneously: spiritual, social, economic, and emotional. And the terrifying part, the part that has to be understood to feel what the Gospels are actually describing, is that there were almost no reliable answers. The options available to a family in first-century Judea facing what they believed to be spirit affliction were limited, costly, and deeply uncertain. The first place most people turned was not a specialist. It was the household itself. Mothers and grandmothers carried knowledge passed down through generations, specific prayers, specific words spoken over a person at night, specific ways of positioning the body during sleep, specific herbs burned to purify a room. Amulets were common, small pieces of metal or clay inscribed with divine names or protective phrases, worn around the neck, tied to the wrist, hung above a doorway. Archaeological excavations across Israel have turned up hundreds of these objects, not from the homes of the elite, but from ordinary village households. This was not fringe practice. This was standard, everyday spiritual protection woven into the fabric of domestic life. The names written on those amulets mattered enormously. The name of God was power, not merely a label, a living, active force. To invoke the correct name in the correct way was to reach for the most powerful protection available. And conversely, to invoke the wrong name, or to invoke correctly but without the proper authority, was to risk making things worse. The spirit world in that framework was not passive. It responded. It pushed back. Stories circulated and were taken seriously of exorcists who attempted to cast out a spirit and found themselves overpowered, attacked, driven out of a house in worse condition than when they entered. This is why the account in the book of Acts, written decades after Jesus, describes 7 sons of a Jewish priest named Sceva, attempting to use the name of Jesus as a formula, and the spirit they confronted responding with words that have echoed across 2,000 years. I know Jesus, and I know Paul, but who are you? What followed was not metaphorical. The afflicted man attacked them physically. They fled the house naked and bleeding. The story was told because it was recognizable. Everyone who heard it understood exactly what had gone wrong. Authority could not be borrowed. It had to be real. But before a family reached that level of specialist intervention, there was a long, exhausting middle ground. There were local figures in most villages who held some reputation for dealing with spiritual affliction. Men and women who knew the traditional formulas, who knew which prayers to pray, which names to invoke, which rituals to perform. Their effectiveness was inconsistent. Everyone knew stories of people who had been helped. Everyone also knew stories of people who had not been helped, or whose condition had worsened, or who had spent what little money the family had on repeated failed attempts before running out of options entirely. And money was never abstract in this world. A family in a Galilean village operated with almost no financial margin. The land, if they owned any, was small. The harvest, if it came, had to stretch across the entire year, and a portion of it went immediately to taxes, to the temple, to debts that accumulated slowly and rarely disappeared. A single bad harvest could begin a chain of events that ended in the loss of the land entirely. In that economic reality, paying an exorcist was not a minor inconvenience. It was a decision made against food, against seed for the next planting, against the basic survival arithmetic of the household. And if the treatment failed, which it often did, the family had lost both the money and the hope. The afflicted person, meanwhile, was often unable to contribute to that household economy at all. A man who could not work the field because of his condition was a man who was consuming resources without producing them. A woman who could not manage the household, could not prepare food, could not care for children, was a structural absence at the center of the family's daily survival. This is not a harsh way of describing human suffering. It is the honest description of what that suffering meant in material terms to people who had no safety net, no institution to absorb the cost, no alternative arrangement. The family held everything together alone, or the family began to fall apart. Some afflicted individuals were eventually excluded from their households entirely, not because their families did not love them, but because the household could no longer absorb the crisis. The man described in the Gospels who lived among the tombs near the region of the Gerasenes had reached that point. He was no longer in a house. He was no longer under a roof. He lived in the place of the dead, in the liminal space between the human world and whatever lay beyond it, because the boundary between him and ordinary life had collapsed completely. He was cutting himself with stones. He could not be restrained. Chains had been tried and broken. He was, by every measure available to that world, beyond help. That is the situation Jesus walked into. But to understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand what had already been tried, what had already failed, and how long that man, and every person who had watched him, had been living without any answer at all. The Gospels do not linger on the years before. They do not describe the attempts, the failed rituals, the prayers that went unanswered, the moment when his family stopped coming. But that history was there. It always was. When Jesus arrived, he was not entering a situation that had just begun. He was entering the far end of a long, terrible road, and the Spirit recognized him before the man did. That detail is not decorative. In the framework of that world, recognition was evidence of reality. The Spirit's immediate, panicked response, crying out, identifying Jesus by name, negotiating, was itself a form of testimony. In a world where authority was everything, where the wrong name produced catastrophe and the right name produced deliverance, the response of the Spirit told everyone present exactly who they were dealing with, not a formula, not a borrowed name, something the spirit world had no defense against. But why? What was it about the presence of Jesus that produced that reaction? And what did it mean to the people who witnessed it? People who had watched every other attempt fail. To answer that question, you have to understand what exorcism actually looked like in the world Jesus inhabited, because what he did was recognizable enough to be compared and different enough to be unforgettable. There was a tradition of exorcism in first-century Judaism. It was not hidden, not marginal, not the practice of fringe figures operating outside the religious mainstream. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, describes watching an exorcist named Eleazar perform a successful exorcism in front of the Roman general Vespasian and a crowd of soldiers. He describes the method in detail. A ring containing a root mentioned in texts attributed to Solomon, held beneath the nose of the afflicted person, words recited from those same Solomonic texts. A basin of water placed nearby as proof that the spirit had departed when it was disturbed on exit. The performance was public. The framework was established. The methodology had a name, a history, and a lineage. That lineage mattered enormously. In the ancient world, the authority behind a practice was inseparable from the practice itself. A physician did not simply prescribe. He invoked the tradition that stood behind his prescription. An exorcist did not simply command. He reached back through a chain of transmitted knowledge to a source powerful enough to compel the spirit to obey. Solomon was the great authority in Jewish exorcistic tradition. His wisdom, his texts, his seals, his rings, these were the credentials. To operate in his name was to operate within a recognized and respected lineage of power. Jesus operated in none of that framework. He did not use a ring. He did not recite lengthy formulas. He did not invoke Solomon or Abraham or the name of an angel. He did not perform the ritual gestures that accompanied traditional exorcistic practice. He did not negotiate at length or construct an elaborate theological scaffolding beneath his commands. What the Gospels record repeatedly is a directness that had no precedent in the tradition. He spoke, the spirits obeyed, and the crowds who watched, crowds who knew exactly what a normal exorcism looked like, who had seen the rituals, who understood the protocol, responded not with polite appreciation, but with something closer to stunned disbelief. The word the Gospel of Mark uses for their reaction is a Greek term that carries the sense of being struck, overwhelmed, knocked sideways by something you were not prepared for. They asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching?" With authority, he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. The question was not merely theological. It was the question of people whose entire framework for understanding spiritual power had just been disrupted by something that did not fit any existing category. That disruption was not only intellectual, it was deeply, viscerally emotional, because the stakes were not abstract. Consider what it meant to be the parent of a child who had been afflicted for years. You had tried everything available. You had prayed, you had paid, you had watched specialists attempt and fail. You had reached the point where hope itself had become a source of pain, because hoping meant risking the devastation of another failure. You had begun to construct, slowly and reluctantly, a life organized around the permanent presence of this suffering, because the alternative, continuing to believe that relief was possible, had become too expensive emotionally to sustain. And then someone arrived who did not perform a ritual, who did not ask for payment, who did not invoke a lineage or a formula or a protective name from a sacred text, who simply spoke, and the thing that had destroyed your child's life left. The Gospels record a scene in the synagogue at Capernaum that captures this precisely. A man with an unclean spirit was present during teaching, which itself tells you something important. He was in the synagogue. He had not been excluded from the community's religious life, at least not yet. The spirit, when it reacted to Jesus, did not wait for a private confrontation. It erupted in public, in the middle of a gathering, in front of everyone. It cried out. It identified Jesus. It used his name and his origin, Jesus of Nazareth. And it asked a question that was really an accusation. Have you come to destroy us? That plural, us, is not incidental. It was the vocabulary of a world in which spirits were understood to operate collectively, in hierarchies, in territories. The fear in that cry was not the fear of one entity facing one opponent. It was the fear of an entire order facing something that threatened the order itself. And the response of Jesus was not a lengthy ritual, it was a command. Be quiet, come out of him. 2 sentences. The spirit convulsed the man, cried out loudly, one final assertion of presence, and left. The silence that followed must have been extraordinary. In that silence, something was being processed that went far beyond the relief of one man. The people in that synagogue were recalibrating everything they thought they knew about how spiritual authority worked, where it came from, and what it looked like when it was real. They had a category for exorcism. They did not have a category for this, and the news spread. The Gospel of Mark, which moves at a pace that feels almost breathless, says immediately that his fame spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. This was not word of mouth in the casual sense. This was the rapid, urgent transmission of information that changes everything. The kind of news that travels because people cannot not tell it, because what they saw demands to be shared, because silence in the face of it would itself feel like a kind of failure. People began coming from everywhere, not just from the immediate village, from the surrounding towns, from the regions beyond. They came carrying the afflicted. They came at the end of roads that had already ended once before, when every other answer had failed. They came not because they had heard a compelling theological argument. They came because they had heard that something was happening that had never happened before, or at least never like this, never with this authority, never without a price and a ritual and a borrowed name that might or might not hold. They came because they were desperate. And desperation in that world was not weakness. It was the honest acknowledgement of how bad things had actually become. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark that most readers pass through too quickly. A father brings his son to the disciples of Jesus, while Jesus himself is away on the mountain with Peter, James, and John. The boy has been afflicted since childhood. Convulsions, falls into fire, falls into water, long periods of rigidity and silence. The father has watched this since the boy was small. He has watched it long enough that he no longer describes it with the raw, shattered language of fresh grief. He describes it the way people describe things they have learned to carry, with a kind of worn precision that is, in its own way, more heartbreaking than tears. The disciples attempt to cast out the spirit. They fail. This is the detail that unlocks everything. These were not strangers. These were the men who had traveled with Jesus, who had watched him operate, who had themselves been sent out in pairs with authority to cast out spirits, and according to the earlier chapters of the same gospel, had done so successfully. But here, in this specific moment, facing this specific affliction, they could not do it. The scribes who were present seized on the failure immediately. An argument erupted. By the time Jesus arrived, there was a crowd gathered around a scene of public failure and theological dispute, with the father and his son at the center of it, waiting, still waiting, having waited all their lives. Jesus asked how long this had been happening. The father answered, "Since childhood." And then he said something that has to be read in the full weight of what it cost him to say it. He said, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." That conditional, "if you can," was not a theological proposition. It was the language of a man who had been disappointed so many times that hope itself had become something he could only approach sideways, with a qualifier built in to protect himself from another collapse. Jesus responded to the conditional directly, "If you can." All things are possible to one who believes, and the Father's answer is one of the most honest sentences in the entire New Testament. I believe. Help my unbelief. That sentence has endured for 2,000 years because it is not a confession of failure. It is the description of the exact interior condition of every person who has ever wanted to trust something and found that wanting was not the same as being able to. It is the prayer of someone standing at the absolute end of what their own strength can sustain, asking not for certainty, but for help with the distance between where they are and where they need to be. Jesus healed the boy. But what happened afterward, in private, is where the weight of the entire narrative settles. The disciples asked him, away from the crowd, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he answered, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." The Greek behind that answer carries a sense of sustained, grounded, ongoing communion, not a formula spoken in the right sequence, not a technique applied with sufficient skill, but something that came from a different place entirely, a place that could not be borrowed or performed or purchased or inherited through lineage. This is the thing that the ancient world understood about evil spirits that the modern world has largely lost. Not the metaphysics of possession, but the deeper truth embedded in the fear itself. The fear was never really about the spirits alone. It was about what the spirits revealed, that human beings are not self-sufficient, that there are dimensions of suffering that exceed every available human remedy, that the gap between what we can do and what needs to be done is sometimes absolute, and that living honestly in the presence of that gap, without pretending it does not exist, without collapsing under it, without manufacturing false certainty to cover it, is one of the most difficult things a human being can do. The world of first-century Judea knew that gap intimately. They felt it in the dark. They felt it in the failed rituals and the borrowed names and the amulets that did not hold. They felt it in the long roads that led to specialists who could not help, and in the economic devastation of trying everything and arriving at nothing. They felt it in the faces of the people they loved who were beyond their reach, living at the edges of ordinary life, in the tombs and the margins, waiting for something that had not come. And then something came. Not a better technique, not a more powerful formula, not a longer lineage or a more sacred text or a more expensive treatment. Something that the spirit world recognized before the human world fully understood what it was seeing. Something that did not negotiate or perform or reach back through a chain of transmitted authority to borrow power from a source. Something that simply was what it claimed to be. And the claim held every time, without exception, without failure, without a basin of water needed to prove the departure. The people who witnessed this were not evaluating a theological system. They were watching something happen that they had been told was impossible, or at least improbable, or at least wildly beyond anything they had personally seen. They were watching the gap close, and the closing of that gap was not, for them, primarily an intellectual event. It was an event that happened in the body, in the family, in the village, in the economics of survival and the social architecture of honor, and the daily lived texture of a world where invisible forces were as real as bread and water and the weight of unpaid debt. Jesus did not descend into that world from a safe distance. He walked its roads, he entered its villages, he sat in its synagogues. He touched people that the purity codes of his own tradition said should not be touched. He crossed the lake to the far shore, Gentile territory, the country of the Gerasenes, specifically to reach a man who had been left entirely alone at the end of every road available to him. He did not send a message. He went. That is the thing the fear of evil spirits, in all its weight and texture and historical specificity, ultimately points toward. Not the darkness itself, but the one who entered the darkness without flinching. Not the desperation of the Father with the qualifier built into his prayer, but the answer that met the qualifier and dissolved it. Not the long history of failed remedies and borrowed names and insufficient authority, but the moment when something arrived that needed none of those supports, because it was, in itself, the source from which all genuine authority had always come. The ancient world feared what it could not control, And what it could not control revealed in the end what it most deeply needed. Not a better system, not a stronger amulet, not a more reliable formula, a presence, real, embodied, unhesitating and entirely unafraid.